Hi, I'm David Barr Kirtley, host of the Geek's Guide to the Galaxy podcast. This panel on Ender's Game and philosophy originally appeared in episode 106 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. To learn more, visit us at geeksguideshow.com. And as I mentioned, our panel topic today will be Ender's Game and philosophy. And this panel will definitely involve spoilers for Ender's Game, so before listening, you might want to go read the book. And I'm joined today by two guest geeks. So first up, we've got D.E. Whitcower. He's an assistant professor of philosophy at Old Dominion University, whose work focuses on digital culture. He edited the books Ender's Game in Philosophy and Philip K. Dick in Philosophy, and has also written articles on Full Metal Alchemist, the iPod, and Occupy Wall Street. So Dylan, welcome to the show.
Great, thank you.
And also joining us today is Ashley Hsu. She's an assistant professor at Virginia Tech, whose work focuses on the uses of technology. She's written articles on nanotech and animals using tools, and also had an article in Ender's Game and Philosophy called Every Breath You Take, about the use of technology to monitor children. So Ashley, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, and so we're going to start out and just talk a little bit about how we first encountered Ender's Game. And I'll start. It's pretty simple. My parents are both big science fiction fans, so I don't know, I was probably about 8 or 9, and they just handed it to me and told me to read it. And I just absolutely loved it. And I think if you're a nerdy kid who gets bullied and likes video games and stuff, Ender's Game just really connects with you in a really, really powerful way. So I just absolutely loved it. Throughout my teenage years, I probably read it over 20 times. I don't even know. And so that's basically me. And so Dylan, how did you first encounter Ender's Game?
I have no idea. I think I must have read it either in like 8th or 9th grade around then, but I have no idea how I came across it. I bet I found it in my older brother's room. He was a fan of science fiction stuff and was something of a taste guide for me. The stuff that he was into was generally good.
And did you really connect with Ender's Game the way sort of were you bullied and a nerdy kid and stuff like that? And...
I don't know, I guess, but I don't think that was really a strong connection for me with the book. I think for me it was just the sort of two senses of wonder that come from the book. The one sense of wonder from the battle room about like being able to think in this way, spatially and strategically. And managing coordinated activity in this very open, three-dimensional, creative space, and that was really exciting. And then the moral free play that comes from the terrible situation and where this leads Ender and everyone else.
Yeah, and we're certainly going to be talking about that today. But before we get to that, Ashley, how did you first encounter Ender's Game?
Well, I was older than you. I was 16 and at a summer Presbyterian regional mission trip thing in Puerto Rico. And another kid, I had already dabbled in Asimov, the gateway drug. And I was told by this other kid that I had to read Orson Scott Card, that it was going to change my life. That I could figure out the universe and love and how it all fit together. And I was told, in no short terms that the Bible wasn't going to, explain a lot of things to me that Orson Scott Card could, which is a weird thing to be told on a Presbyterian trip when you're just hanging out with some of your new friends. So I was told, and I immediately picked the books up and read the trilogy and then the quadrology, I guess. And I loved them. They were wonderful. And I didn't know about all of Orson Scott Card's religious weirdness at that point. I was just, and I didn't love Ender's Game the most. I loved Speaker for the Dead. The idea that, well, I guess I shouldn't get into that since this is about Ender's Game particularly, but Ender's Game was moving, but it was the later books that really stirred something exciting in me.
All right, cool. So let's talk about this book, Ender's Game in Philosophy. So Dylan, how did this book come about?
Well, I had written for this series before several times. This was my fifth book in this series. So I'm used to organizing these works on popular culture and philosophy. And when I heard for the first time that this movie was actually happening, that, you know, finally it wasn't just vague rumors, but that a movie was going to finally happen from this book, I immediately said, okay, yeah, that's great. That will provide a market for us to produce this philosophical work on this book. And I already knew the relevant publisher and editor, so I just called them up and made a very brief pitch, and they said, "Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Let's do it."
And how did you go about lining up the contributors? Did you know who was an Ender's Game fan, or did you have to ask people? Or
yeah, the way that I usually do this, the way that we usually do these volumes in general, is we put out a call for proposals. So this goes out to various philosophy email listservs, and it's just a brief thing saying, hey, we're putting this book together. We want proposals. Proposals should look like this. Possible topics might include, and, you know, send them to us by this date.
So if there are any philosophers listening to this who might want to write for one of these books, what sort of listservs should they be following?
Probably the two main listservs are a sort of US-centric one, Phil Updates, and then a UK and Europe-centered one, Philos-L.
So everyone check those out. And so, Ashley, how did you get involved with this project?
Well, I've known Dylan for a while, and I've seen a couple of the other book projects he's done, and I saw on Phil Updates this being advertised. And I've never been tempted to do one of Dylan's popular culture books before, just because I wasn't as interested in the subject matter. But when I heard he was doing Ender's Game, I crapped myself. I was so excited. And it took a while to figure out what I wanted to do. But I think as soon as I had seen the email, within a day, I had already written up my proposal and had my fingers crossed. Just because I'm so interested in the subject matter, and Ender's Game provides so much for discussion that I knew the book would be great. And I know Dylan's a great editor, so he'd make us all sound good, even if we're not naturally good at writing for popular audiences.
And I mentioned in your introduction that your piece was about monitoring children. You want to just say a bit about how you came to that topic?
Well, I've always been struck by the monitors and how they're used to watch over Ender. And I'd recently read Ender's Shadow, which says more about the monitors and how the children are watched. And I have two small children myself, and we use, baby monitors to listen in on their conversations when they're upstairs. And it just struck me as something that could be like really sinister, even though I'm using it for good. So I wanted to sort of explore how this technology can be used for not such great things, even though we think of it in our daily lives as, being great. I can check up on my children, no problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you talk in your article about your ambivalence about continuing to monitor your kids as they become teenagers and so on. And I feel like society has gotten more and more overprotective almost of kids, particularly as they get into adolescence. I saw this interesting article where it was like they showed a map of where the grandfather, these three generations had lived in the same town, and the grandfather was allowed to explore this area, and then the father was allowed to explore this much, much smaller area, and the son was essentially not allowed to leave this yard. Right.
Yeah. No, it means childhood used to be, you go outside and play on your own with, your buddies that you meet hanging out in wherever you are, but more and more we're drawing perimeters, putting up fences, not letting our kids leave yards in the way we used to. And I mean, it certainly has been a huge shift, and we are monitoring them. I mean, studies show that we're spending more time with our kids, which I mean is good, right? We're spending more time with our kids, but at the same time, our kids are under our direct supervision for much longer times in their lives. And you get the whole phenomena of helicopter parenting that's become more of an issue. And I don't know, I feel like we should be deeply ambivalent, and that children do need privacy and an ability to do things outside of their parents' control. I hope this doesn't come back to bite me in the ass when my kids get older. I mean, I worry about this. I don't know that I have any good solutions for it, but I think Ender's Game gives us one, ultra monitored situation where things are absolutely evil for the children.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and I mentioned that one of the things that really captured my imagination as a kid was just the way that Ender's Game portrayed bullying, and the bullying. We really see it comes to a head when Ender at the beginning of the novel has his monitor removed, and suddenly the other kids who all dislike him know that the adults aren't watching him at all times anymore. And we have this scene where this Ender fights this bully Stilson and gets him on the ground, and it's essentially won the fight at that point and has the opportunity to walk away, but he chooses to just completely, he turns out beat this kid to death, but beat him, really, really badly when he's down, on the premise that this will prevent other kids from that he'll scare the other kids so badly that they won't want to ever mess with him again.
Yeah, and that ethos goes, you see Ender using that reasoning over and over. He beats someone not just enough, but enough to annihilate, and it's why they use him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But so, Dylan, what do you think of that scene? What do you think of both? Is this an effective strategy to get people not to mess with you? And is it an ethical strategy? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I've mostly thought about this in terms of just war theory. So in terms of, we read this today, even though Card couldn't have possibly written it this way, of course, but we read this today in terms of the Bush Doctrine, that we need to voluntarily take on the position of the aggressor in order to forestall future confrontation. Because, obviously what he's doing here is he's moving beyond a proportional response to a conscientiously disproportional response as a deterrent. So it's very consciously taking on the position not of self-defense, but as future self-defense against future non-actual and possibly never to be actualized aggression, to engage in preemptive aggression. There are plenty of other historical precedents that we can turn to and that should come to mind here. Ones that, since in 1984 they were in fact in the past rather than the future, ones that it's much more likely Card was in fact thinking about. So things like the firebombing of Dresden, the just massive disproportional violence that we saw in World War II, of course with Hiroshima ultimately.
Dylan, do you think the commentary in Ender's Game is one to justify a lot of these things? Because it seems like we're supposed to see Ender as a victim and as a pawn, and
Right.
Most of the people who are reading this, even our host here talks about how he related to it. People who have been bullied. I certainly related to that aspect, and you kind of want to cheer for Ender at the same time he's doing these horrible things.
Yeah, and that's a really problematic aspect of this. If we fall into that too quickly, then we end up in this situation where something like the Bush Doctrine, which is very troubling, even if we want to accept it, it's very troubling, and it directly flies in the face of maybe 1,500 years of just war theory. Now, with that said, there's so much else about the book that drives us to question that. Of course, that it turns out to have been unnecessary. But that's ambiguous because, how would we have known that it was unnecessary? It's sort of like with the missing weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The claim was, we can't let the smoking gun be a mushroom cloud. The outcome for not taking aggressive action right now is so severe that it justifies what otherwise is an illegal aggression.
Right. Like in the book, you mentioned this philosopher Michael Walzer, who has this idea of the supreme emergency.
Uh-huh.
And it seems like the situation faced by the international fleet in Ender's Game is like the ultimate supreme emergency, right? The entire existence of the human race is at risk in this conflict. And so in that context, like what, how much risk is acceptable when what's at stake is the existence of the human species, right? I mean, Ashley, what do you think about the way that the IF handles the bugger threat in Ender's Game?
I mean, I guess I reject a lot of what builds up in Ender's Game. I mean, people are defined in particular ways and they have to follow through given how they've been described. But if I were put in charge, I think I'd try to refuse to play like Ender did at one point until he was convinced by Valentine to go back. I would try to utterly deny any involvement in this and try to get away. In a way, Ender certainly does. I don't think Colonel Graff tries to get out of it. He just tries to do his job, but he's part of a military structure that pushes him in that way.
Because, I mean, it just seems to me that part of the big tragedy of Ender's Game is that many of the characters are acting in what they see as the best interests of humanity. But in the end, they end up doing this horrible, unnecessary, brutal war crime, sort of.
Yeah, well, part of what I enjoy about this book is it reveals how dirty consequentialism is, right? This book, everyone is a dirty consequentialist. The ends justify the means. We're all working towards this end. Even Valentine, the sweetest character in the book, gets enlisted by Colonel Graff. And it makes everyone's hands look dirty with this consequentialism that you only care about the ends. And when you only care about the ends, everything turns to shit.
I mean, Dylan, what do you think? Do you agree with that? That this shows up the downsides of consequentialism?
Yeah, certainly. And there's throughout that consequentialist perspective is depicted as non-optional throughout. So like Ender's attempt to drop out, it's like, well, you can't just opt out of this situation that humanity is in. And so, it doesn't make sense just to say, well, I just prefer not to, do this stuff.
Yeah, everyone has to play. I mean, that's what's going on in the book. Yeah.
Yeah. And it actually reminds me a lot of Immanuel Kant's discussion of just war theory in his essay Perpetual Peace. He outlines a series of rules that need to be followed if we're ever going to reach lasting international peace. He actually says standing armies need to be abolished if we're ever going to have peace. Because otherwise what'll happen is we put together one standing army and then everyone around us says, well, they're peaceful, but what if they're not peaceful tomorrow? We need to be ready. So everyone ends up preparing for war, even though no one's interested in war. And then eventually someone needs to make the first strike, because if they don't, then if the other person decides that they're going to make the first strike, then they'll win. And so you have to make the first strike because someone else might actually just be interested in making the first strike because they think that you might someday be interested in making the first strike in case they happen to become aggressive at some point, which they're not. And so peaceful nations are forced into war.
Well, it seems like the buggers would have been safer if they had just dismantled their army, right? Like if there had been no bugger fleet and humanity had come to the bugger homeworld with never met any resistance and saw that they had no weapons, the whole situation would have been solved, right?
Yeah, and I think you're right. And I think, it's not just the humans who are at fault here. Not just in the misunderstanding of the first two invasions, but as you suggest, if the buggers really wanted to say, like, hey, we didn't know what was up, then they should have stood down.
Mm-hmm. Actually, speaking of Kant, I thought it was really interesting in the book that Kant imagined an alien race sort of like the buggers. That was news to me.
Yeah, from the anthropology. Yeah, it's a really weird thing. I mean, Kant, he wanted to try to talk about pure reason in a way that would be, just looking at what was logically necessary for pure reason. And that meant that whatever he said would have to apply to any being with reason. And that included non-human corporeal beings. It also included like angels. and it's hard to know exactly how much he was thinking about this in terms of like likelihood, whether it was aliens or angels thinking about like, hey, these things are probably out there, so I should talk about them. He was probably just saying these things are conceptually possible, so I need to talk about them.
Kant is still going to look at the individual as the source of reason, and I'm not sure that the buggers can be made sense of as individuals in the way Kant would have thought about it. I mean, because he's still thinking about individuals, whether they're humans, animals, angels, whatever. They are the source of reason, and those are the things that we have to look at. I mean, maybe the queen would just count.
Yeah, I think certainly any sensible interpretation of this would have to say only the queen counts, and we have to understand all the soldiers as just, disconnected parts of her body. That they're non-contiguous body parts, and that's kind of the end of it. Because, as you say, yeah, they don't have the capacity for reason, so they can't possibly count as persons for Kant.
Okay, cool. So, I also wanted to talk about Valentine and Peter Wiggin. What do you guys think of Valentine's actions in the book? I mean, she's helping her brother, who's a sort of diagnosable sociopath, but then he ends up bringing about world peace and just, possibly presenting an all-out war. So is Valentine, I don't know, what do we think about her actions in the book?
Oh, I think she's the worst. I think, she's held up as this sort of moral paragon, the one person Ender can trust. And I feel like she betrays him in the book when she goes to the pond and convinces him to go back in. I mean, this is a little boy who she's not protecting. She's not the obvious sociopath like Peter is. But in some ways, because of what she does to Ender, I think she's about 1,000,000 times worse. I would call her the worst person in the book if I had to.
But I mean, given the information that she has, doesn't she think that Ender's actions are necessary to protect Earth?
She does. But I still think that there are duties to protect children that override a lot of that. I mean, she sent him back to battle school. She sent him back to everything that was stressing him out, that made him burn out. And she knows full well that sending him back means the stress on him, even if it means the benefit of the world. I mean, this is where consequentialism is dirty again.
But I mean, but we do have to consider the consequences at some level, right? I mean, otherwise, I mean, if we're gonna consider a virtue ethics or something else instead, we would say like Valentine would want to act in a way, we would want Valentine to act in an admirable way, and that would be to act in the best interest of her beloved brother.
Mm-hmm.
But then what are the consequences of that for the Earth? They could be very, very dire indeed for all she knows.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. She's acting as a consequentialist as she ought to. I think in later books, Valentine acts much less like a consequentialist, and you see in the development of the series a move from a look at consequentialism to really an exploration of virtue ethics. Although now I got off of Ender's Game again and got into the other books, and I'm sorry about that. But it's hard for me to consider Valentine alone in this book.
Yeah, I mean, Dylan, do you think Valentine? I mean, there's a lot of bad people in this book. Do you think that Valentine is really the worst of them?
I'm not sure. I don't think so. I think probably I want to say Peter's the worst. But yeah, but I think there are very good reasons why we react in this way to Valentine. So Valentine is in very much the same position that Graf is, but and thinks about things in very much the same way, but we weight it differently because of her gender and because of the nature of the relationship that she has with Ender. The place that she's stuck is in between two kinds of ethical demands which are incompatible. And those are demands of justice and demands of care. She, due to her relationship, she has this particular obligation to look after her brother as her brother. That, their relationship dictates that she show favoritism towards him, and that there's really an ethical imperative to look after him and be in that relationship of special trust. And yet she's also thinking on a world political level, and capable of that, and in a position to actually do something on that level too. And so the demands of justice, which mean maybe sacrificing a child's moral character, not just making them miserable, but making them in fact kind of a bad person on purpose. That maybe that's worth it. Those moral hazards of the child soldier that Ender is made to suffer, that might be worth it. And so she's at this position of weighing care against justice. And at least from the perspective of justice, from traditional consequentialist, and to some extent also duty-based moral theories, if you put care above the universal, if you put your particular commitments and your particular relationships above the greater good, that doesn't make you a good sister. That makes you a horrible person. That makes you selfish. I also wanted to say Graf is in the same kind of position because he really does love Ender. And he's also in a relationship of trust with Ender in this sort of teacher and proxy parent kind of relationship. But we let him off the hook much more than we let Valentine off the hook. One is that teacher relationship is much more attenuated, especially because it's in a military context where we expect commanders to do bad things, and to send people off to die and so on. That's not part of the normal brother-sister relationship, sending off your sibling to die. So that's one reason why we let him off the hook, even though he's in this same position of being at the crossroads of obligations of care, or relationship of care, and obligations of justice.
Well, so why do you think that Peter is the worst of the characters?
I think he's just the worst person. And in some sense, that's kind of not his fault. He kind of got a bad draw in terms of moral character. And what he does with that is actually really praiseworthy. It actually gets us into another weird issue in Kantian moral theory, where for Kant, what's morally praiseworthy is when you do the right thing because it's the right thing. And so somebody who is just all smiles and sweetness and light and like just instinctually stops to help others because that's what you do, it is actually not terribly morally praiseworthy. Somebody who's morally praiseworthy for Kant is somebody whose instincts are to be cruel and miserly, and who cares for others because it's the right thing to do, rather than because it's just instinctual. Peter's instincts are the worst of anyone's, I think.
Mm-hmm. But it's kind of interesting because Peter's motives are the worst, but essentially the impact of his actions are the best. Whereas Ender's motives are the best, but the impact of his actions are the worst.
Yeah. So, I mean, in saying I think Peter is the worst person, at the same time, we might want to also call him really morally praiseworthy, because not just his consequences are the best, but what he does with his horrible moral instincts is really transformative of himself ultimately too. That he becomes a good leader, working from this terrible material. And then Ender starts from really quite good material, and then it's just constantly perverted. So like he wants to achieve peace, and he does that through disproportionate violence against kids.
I mean, Ashley, what do you think about this stuff we're saying about Ender and Peter? Do you have?
Oh, I agree that Peter starts out the worst, but he does. I mean, he's a self-transformation story where you don't um, get that from nearly. You don't get that nearly so much from the other characters except for Ender, where the transformation by the end of the book is so radical. I mean, Graf and Valentine are um, much more static because they have certain roles to fill in the book. But the contrast between Peter, they go, and Ender going opposite directions is one of the more interesting parts of Ender's Game.
Mm-hmm. I mean, another essay in the book that really made me think was there's one where it brings up the issue of okay. So at the end of the book, Ender finds that he's wiped out the buggers, but one of them is still alive. This hive queen egg, and he preserves it. And this essay makes the point. Ender makes this decision that we think is probably the right decision, but he makes it without consulting anyone else. And does he have the right to decide on behalf of all of humanity to preserve this potentially very dangerous alien species?
I mean, all of humanity, in some sense, has betrayed Ender at this point. I don't think he has any reasonable way of thinking that what would happen to the Hive Queen would be anything except a sure and swift death. And I think this move, I mean, and you see it in the later books, is redemptive, that he can, resurrect this species at some point to sort of compensate for what he personally did to them. Even though he was a pawn in this scheme, he does take his role in it very seriously. And I think his concealing the bugger shows that he does not want to be a pawn anymore. I mean, his whole life, victim, pawn, bullied, naive, used. I don't think he has any other choice but if he's going to be a moral person in the end, is to take this thing, this bugger, the Hive Queen, and hope to do something with her someday. And I think he has to leave the rest of humanity out of the decision because he knows what they do, and he knows what they've done to him.
Mm-hmm. Is Ender right, do you think, to feel guilt over what he did to the buggers when he didn't know what he was doing?
Yes. I think he might realize that he was naive to not realize what was happening. If you read Ender's Shadow, which follows Bean, his battle school buddy, Bean knows full well what's happening. He walks through the walls. I hope I'm not giving anything for subsequent movies away. But he, is spying on the commanders, and he knows what they're setting him up for. And Bean knows what's happening at all times. And once you read Ender's Shadow, you think to yourself, how did Ender not realize what was happening with the way in which things were structured? All the final battle, everyone is present. Ender accepts what people tell him and his position in things on a regular basis in a way maybe he should feel ashamed of. Even though he's a child, and I feel bad even saying that in the first place. I mean, he has every right to be naive, and he is the victim, but at the same time, at some point, I mean, wouldn't the light turn on that, these people are forcing me to a particular action in the way that they're shaping me? It isn't just, I'm going to be a really good commander. It's, all these games, they're leading to something. And, Bean realizes it, and Bean is just as smart as Ender. And I think you see some frustration on Bean's part, or maybe it's not frustration, but it's how can Ender, who we're just as smart as the other one, how can he not see what they're pushing him towards? Or maybe it's willful ignorance at some point. I don't know.
So we're running a little short on time here. So I guess just I want to ask you guys if there's anything else in the book that you just want to highlight a little bit, any essays that stand out in your minds or anything like that?
Well, of course, mine. Everyone should read just my essay. Uh, 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 I don't know. I really enjoyed the chapter that was put together on questions of character because of all the reasons we've discussed. The characters in this book have such interesting relationships to each other and change in such interesting ways over time that I felt that discussion was really good in the book.
I mean, of course, I'm pleased with what I managed to put together for my chapter as well. And yeah, I mean, Ashley, your chapter was great fun, and you know, I'm also at the similar places and dynamics with monitoring and thinking about whether and to what extent I'm becoming a helicopter with regard to my children, and yeah, so that those details, of course, speak to me very personally as well. Um, yeah, I don't know. I was very pleased with the diversity of different topics that we got in and the kinds of approaches to them. The discussion about Peter and Valentine, I think, is really interesting, and I'm so sad that those characters got so attenuated in the film.
Mm.
So, like Alex Halavez's chapter on blogs and Demosthenes and the history of demagoguery and anonymity, it's great stuff. And he's a new media scholar who I happen to know, and he mentioned that he was a fan of Ender's Game, and he saw my call, and it was like, write something about blogging. This is what you do. And I harassed him until he did.
Well, and that chapter is really interesting because it's written in the format of a back and forth debate between Locke and Demosthenes, the online personas of Peter and Valentine.
Yeah, and he sent that to me, and he's like, well, I don't know if this is what you wanted, but it is. And I was like, no, this is awesome. You don't need to worry. And then we talked a bit about Peter, and there's a just fascinating chapter about Peter and Machiavelli, and sort of in some sense rehabilitating Peter, or I think it's more on that end rather than debasing Machiavelli. Yeah, and I wasn't expecting, when I put together the call, that was something I just wasn't on my radar, and that came in, and I was like, that's really cool. It's a really nice direction to take with this. So yeah, but one that I do want to specifically mention as well is the one on queer theory. And as the book was developing, this is something that was coming out in the news about Orson Scott Card, his really quite offensive views about homosexuality, which are, I mean, deeply at odds with the content of his writing. So, you know, really disorienting to fans to be confronted by this intolerance.
It makes me so angry.
Yeah, and Ashley, I know you've got a very distinctive take on this that I want to be sure that you talk about, because you've got a great take on this. But yeah, that chapter I kind of commissioned part of the way through of editing. I contacted someone and said, "Hey, could you do something about queer theory?" I mean, someone. I'm Nick Michaud, one of the authors of that chapter. I contacted Nick and said, "Hey, could you do something on queer theory and Ender's Game?" And he was like, "That would be awesome. I want to do that." And it turned out just fabulous. It's a great chapter, and points out really compelling stuff, showing that there's something weird going on with Card and with Card's writing and with Card's issues about this. I mean, as Michaud points out in there, he ends up sleeping in the same room as his older teacher as part of his training on on Eros. Like that's where they are. They're on Eros, and they're staying in the same room. And it's there's some really weird. I mean, the shower fight scene, of course, is really there's a great deal of ambivalence going on about young boys wrestling together, and after as Nick Michaud points out, again, I this is something I just hadn't seen, but there's this line that he found about how he would follow Bonzo's hips anywhere, and that's it's a really distinctive way to describe leadership. So that was really cool. The way that turned out, and it's great. But yeah, Ashley, you've got a particular take on Card and his intolerance.
Oh, I am made so angry in knowing about Card's hate. I wish I had never known any of that, because to me, Ender's Game and Speaker for the Dead and the other books in the Enderverse, which is the Ender universe, which all you geeks probably already know that. Sorry. After reading these, I was really high on the idea that if you could love another that you don't know, that if you could know them, then you're forced to love them. So Ender gets to know the Hive Queen and can't help but love her and help her in her ends. I mean, Card has it all wrapped together: love, hate, war, peace, reconciliation. The idea that if you know someone well enough and you understand their motives, which comes out in Speaker for the Dead, the idea of the Speaker for the Dead is if you can tell a person's life story as it happened, with all the horrible parts of it in as well, that you can understand them and you are forced to love that person. I mean, this is part of what makes up all of Orson Scott Card's novels in the Enderverse. The idea that knowledge is love. Forget this children at war stuff. The Ender books are about love and understanding and acceptance. And you can encounter something completely foreign to yourself, a true other, and once you understand it, the love is there. I mean, and that Orson Scott Card can be so hateful at all just makes no sense. If he reads his own books, I think he'll understand better what I mean here. And love is redemptive. I mean, it's redeeming the Hive Queen.
Well, yeah, and I mean, Orson Scott Card is a very controversial figure, and oftentimes, anytime his name comes up, a lot of passionate, commentary ensues. Have you seen any of that in regard to this book? Have you gotten any sort of what sort of reactions to it have you gotten?
Oh, I've had one of my friends tell me they would never read Orson Scott Card's works, or engage in any of this, and that I'm silly to put my name on something in this book because Orson Scott Card is such a hateful bigot. I think there has been a huge backlash. I mean, at least among people who would otherwise read and enjoy these books.
Yeah, I think I've really I've heard more moderate kind of claims, probably because but as editor, I think maybe that would just appear more impolite for someone to me about it in that way. But yeah, I mean, I've heard from several people saying, like, I was totally excited about this movie, and now that I know more about Card, suddenly, like, I can't go, I can't support him sort of ever again. And of course, this book gets caught up in this, because people just want to say, like, I loved what I got from that book, but I have to walk away now. I have to disengage. So I think the success of the book must get caught up in some of the boycott. But having that discussion in there about, there's let's look seriously at what's going on actually in Ender's Game about homosexuality, and seeing that what's going on there is actually quite ambivalent. I think that that approach and just sort of, meeting it head on, like let's seriously look at what's going on in here about this. I think that helped to blunt any possible criticism of us as, perpetuating an anti-gay agenda. Even though, it's an unavoidable and troubling association. And incidentally, when I started the project, I had no idea about any of this either. As I think most of the fans didn't, until suddenly it was part of a potential blockbuster motion picture, and then this was everywhere. But when I started the book, no idea.
I mean, just quickly, what did you guys think of the movie?
I loved the movie. I thought they did. I mean, I'm always skeptical when I'm going into a book. I really like the new movie of it, and I thought they did a much better job than I expected. They stayed truer to the book. The battle room was awesome, and usually I'm not going into movies for special effects, but it was very cool, and it does help you think out some scenes in the book that for me were kind of hazy because of the flying around in the room. I thought that was very cool. I was really disappointed in the ending, of course, because it seems like if there is a sequel, it's going to look nothing like the sequel to Ender's Game, which would really be disappointing.
Yeah, and that was a sort of weird thing going in, that you can see how Ender's Game is positioned to be a huge blockbuster, and then the sequels to Ender's Game just aren't. Like, Speaker for the Dead would be a really great movie, but it would be very, very different.
It wouldn't be exciting.
It wouldn't appeal to the same audience.
Yeah, definitely.
And I mean, it's kind of an amazing thing that worked for so many fans of the novel to go on to the next and be like, hey, this is a totally different kind of story. Anyway, the film itself, I think they made good choices about how to fail, given that failure was inevitable, in the way that adaptations of books, this always happens. You need to leave out huge amounts of things. I was very sad to see Peter and Valentine's characters just become props. But I don't know, what else could have been cut. So that was disappointing, but okay, sure. I totally agree about the battle room. They did a great job with making the special effects make that real without having them take over, without having the special effects become the film. One thing that I don't have a good handle on is how the film worked for people who hadn't read the book. Because I read one review from somebody who mentioned that she hadn't read the book, and it was totally disorienting to me. This film critic who talked about, like, well, it's too bad that they didn't really develop the romantic interest, and and that was one part where Petro was taking him to show how to be a good sniper, how to use these freeze weapons effectively at long range and so on. And the way it was shot out in the theater was like, oh God. Like they couldn't resist taking the one possible opening for vague sexy times and like putting that in.
I was so worried they were gonna kiss. My hands were digging into the seat. I was like, oh no, don't let them kiss, don't let them kiss.
Yeah, and this
it would ruin it.
And this critic was like, well, couldn't they have just, had a kiss in there somewhere? And it was so totally the opposite reaction that I guess we had both had. But, part of that is the way that they made the characters older.
Hmm.
where the characters as they appear in the film, I'm approaching them through the book, so I'm still seeing them as like, well, keeping in the back of my mind, he's supposed to be 7 right here, even though obviously he isn't.
Yeah.
And so if they had filmed those characters embodied in this older way kissing, that would have been like deeply creepy for me in a way that it wasn't for someone who had never read the book. So yeah, I don't have much perspective on the film as a standalone thing. And that's kind of interesting on its own.
All right, great. So I promised to let Ashley go at 11, so we should start wrapping this up now. I guess just do you guys have any other projects you're working on? Any upcoming books or papers or anything you want to mention?
I'm working on a book about non-human animal tool use and how we can make sense of it in our theories about technology. If that makes sense. So chimps who use tools, crows that use tools, how do we make sense of them given what we've said about technology? It seems like some of these things count. Um, so yeah, it's a fun book.
Are you looking at all at sort of more instinctual, less creative problem solving directed
Oh,
use, like trapdoor
yes.
spiders and birds' nests and stuff like that?
Yes. So there's a whole bunch of literature on birds, but there's also things that are interesting about Beaver Dam Building,
Right.
and how if you play a tape recorder of rushing water in a place where there has been no rushing water, but there are beavers present, they'll fell a whole bunch of trees, and put a whole bunch of stuff to muffle that sound. It seems like they're reacting to the sound of rushing water where it's the loudest, of course, is where the stream is most narrow, and that's where they build their dams. So there's some interesting literature about beavers as well that I really enjoy. So I'm trying to look at the whole spectrum, and not just the cases that we know are easy to deal with.
And then Dylan, do you have what are you working on?
Yeah, I'm working in too many directions. I have a sort of sustained research program in developing uh, philosophical theories about Facebook and social networking and our engagement with each other, our pursuit of relationships, and ethical action on Facebook. The presence of politics on Facebook, especially, is related to Occupy and other new social movements. So that's the sort of long-term thing that I've been working on. And in the meantime, I keep getting distracted by just fascinating stuff that I see. Like I'm working on something about bacon right now, trying to make sense of why bacon is such a prominent part of internet culture.
Francis
And
or Roger?
yeah, no, that would be the reasonable thing for a philosopher to be working on. But yeah, I actually just did an interview last Thursday with a reporter working on this topic, trying to tell the story of um, the rise of bacon in our culture today. It's a weird thing. I also have a similar project on internet cats. So yeah, I'm trying to organize a workshop in October that I'm co-organizing. I would be co-facilitating to try to put together a research program among a group of scholars who are interested in this. Because right now, doing some background lit review stuff, um, there's so little done on the theory of cats online and sort of cuteness online in general that it looks like I may in fact be the leading scholar on this right now with my mere 2 publications on the topic. This is just, it's not happening. Uh, and it needs to. This is important. This
Mm.
is significant and strange and calls for explanation.
And I mentioned that you in the bio that you had a book called Philip K. Dick and Philosophy as well.
Right.
Do you have other stuff that's so directly relevant to science fiction fans?
Mm. Um, Not at this time. Um, I I hope at some point to be doing some work with Lovecraft.
That would be cool.
Yeah, of course not science fiction, but obviously same kind of fan base.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, not at this moment otherwise, and no direct plans right now for Lovecraft. I've sort of a long-term scheme about where to place that and how to organize that.
All right, cool. Well, I would read it.
Yeah,
if that helps.
sure. Everything helps. Yeah.
Just keep me posted on the cats.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think we're going to wrap things up there. So, Ashley, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, David.
And Dylan, thanks for joining us.
Great, thanks very much.
And that was our panel. So, thanks to everyone for listening. And we hope you'll check out more of our interviews and panels over at geeksguideshow.com. Thanks.